Je deviens émotionnelle maintenant. Zut alors. Il est resté très en arrière.
In royal Europe, scandals are often buried beneath velvet curtains, polite smiles, and carefully staged family photographs. But some secrets do not stay buried. Some return with court orders, DNA tests, and the slow, humiliating collapse of a royal myth. This was one of those stories. Because this was not merely a rumor whispered through palace corridors. It was not just another tale of a king who once loved outside his marriage. It became something far more dangerous than gossip. It became a daughter standing before the law, demanding that the most protected man in Belgium say, at last, what he had denied for years, that she was his child. Public debate around Delphine's identity intensified after a 1999 biography of Queen Paula revived allegations that Albert had maintained a long, extramarital relationship from which a daughter had been born, and years later Delphine's battle moved through the courts until DNA evidence confirmed Albert II was her biological father. Imagine the image: a former king, a courtroom, a woman who had spent much of her life being treated like an inconvenience, now forcing the monarchy to confront blood, truth, and memory. King Albert II had resisted her claim for years. The courts ordered a DNA test. He was even threatened with daily fines if he kept refusing. And when the result finally came, the old denial could no longer survive. In January 2020, his legal team acknowledged that the science showed he was Delphine's father. By October, the court went further still. Delphine was granted the title Princess of Belgium, and the Belgian monarchy now officially lists her as Albert's daughter. But the real wound in this story was never only legal, it was emotional. What does it do to a woman to grow up in the shadow of a palace that knows who she is, yet will not open the door? How does a royal family protect its dignity for decades, while one daughter fights simply to be named? And how did a hidden love affair become one of the most painful reckonings in modern Belgian royal history? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, back before the court rulings, before the titles, before the silence turned into war. Delphine was not born into obscurity. She arrived in 1968 inside the elegant, guarded world of Belgian high society, a world of titles, manners, polished rooms, and carefully preserved appearances. On paper, she belonged to a privileged family. She was raised in the orbit of wealth and rank, with Baroness Sibylle de Cely-Longchamp as her mother and Jacques Boel, heir to a powerful industrial dynasty, as the man the world believed to be her father. It was, from the outside, the sort of life that looked complete, orderly, protected, almost untouchable. But some childhoods are wounded not by poverty or chaos, but by silence. And silence, in aristocratic families, can be far colder. Delphine was officially recognized only much later as the daughter of Albert II. Before that, she grew up under another name, inside another story, one that would eventually crack open in public. The deeper pain in her story was not simply that a secret existed, but that it seems to have shaped the emotional climate around her. Her mother's relationship with Albert reportedly lasted for years, and after it ended, Sibylle moved to London. Reuters notes that she later spoke publicly about that relationship, and that she and Jacques Boel divorced in 1978. Even without dramatic scenes, a child can feel when the adults around her are carrying something unspoken, a name not fully explained, a presence that cannot be acknowledged, a truth that hovers, yet is never allowed to land. In such a world, identity does not arrive as comfort, it arrives as confusion. And perhaps that is where the roots of Delphine's later fight were planted. Not merely in scandal, but in emotional displacement. To grow up in privilege, yet with a question mark where certainty should be. To be close enough to power to sense it, yet too far away to be claimed by it. A child in that position may learn early that love can be conditional, that reputation can matter more than tenderness, and that adults will sometimes protect a system before they protect a heart. That kind of upbringing can leave behind a very specific hunger, not for money, not even for status, but for acknowledgement, for the simple human dignity of hearing the truth spoken aloud. And long before Delphine ever entered a courtroom, that need may already have been living quietly inside her. But childhood wounds do not remain in childhood. They follow people into ambition, into romance, into the image they build for the world. And in Delphine's case, the next chapter would be just as revealing, because before she became the woman who challenged a king, she first became a woman who learned how to turn pain into art. Before the courts, before the headlines, before the word princess was legally attached to her name, Delphine tried to build something that belonged entirely to her. Not a title, not an inheritance, not even an explanation. She built an artistic identity. She trained in London, earning a Bachelor of Arts with honours from the Chelsea School of Art, and over the years developed a body of work that was vivid, playful, confrontational, and unmistakably personal. On her own artist site, she describes herself as a statement artist and colorist, moving across painting, video, sculpture, and neon. Her exhibitions would later stretch from Belgium to France and beyond, giving the impression of a woman who had not merely survived a fractured private life, but transformed it into a bold visual language. And to the public, that image had power. She was not presented as a tragic figure standing outside palace gates. She looked like someone who had carved out her own world, modern, expressive, self-made, socially confident, surrounded by colour where others might have expected shame. There is something almost defiant in that. In a royal story built on secrecy, Delphine's art did not whisper. It announced itself. It used brightness, irony, shape, and provocation, almost like armour. A woman raised in the cold shadow of discretion had chosen a language that could not be ignored. Her public profile as a contemporary artist is also reflected on the Belgian monarchy's own family page today, which identifies her as a renowned contemporary artist who occasionally joins royal public activities. But glitter, especially in stories like this, can be misleading because success is not the same thing as peace. Visibility is not the same thing as belonging. Reuters reported that by 2008, Delphine was publicly presenting her book, Cutting the Cord, a work in which she recounted her life and showed examples of her art. That title alone says more than many interviews ever could. It sounds less like a career move than an emotional diagnosis, a cutting away, a severing. The kind of phrase that suggests someone trying, desperately and elegantly, to free herself from a bond that had never properly held. So yes, there was glamour. There were exhibitions, catalogues, the cultivated aura of an artist who seemed entirely in control of her image. But beneath that polished facade stood a woman, living with a peculiar form of loneliness, famous enough to be watched, yet not fully acknowledged. Creative enough to turn pain into beauty, yet never allowed to forget where that pain began. Her career gave her a stage. It gave her a voice. But it could not give her the one sentence she had wanted to hear from the beginning. And then, as so often happens in stories shaped by old wounds, love arrived not as a rescue from the past, but as the next place where all that buried hurt could quietly follow. In this story, the great forbidden romance does not belong to Delphine herself. It belongs to the two people whose hidden love would shape her entire life, Prince Albert of Belgium and Baroness Sibylle de Selly-Longchamp. And that is what makes this chapter so unsettling. Delphine did not choose the scandal. She inherited it. She was born from a relationship that, by every outward standard, was impossible from the start. Later accounts from Delphine and her mother described it not as a brief indiscretion, but as a long affair that lasted for years, beginning in the 1960s when Albert and Sybil met through Sybil's father. By then, both were tied to troubled marriages, and whatever drew them together had to exist in shadow from the very beginning. That is often how the most destructive love stories begin in royal circles. Not with evil, not with open cruelty, but with secrecy dressed up as necessity, a private refuge, a stolen tenderness. A relationship that feels more intense precisely because it cannot breathe in daylight. Albert was already married to Paula, the future queen, and bound not only by vows, but by dynasty, religion, and the theatre of monarchy itself. Sybil, too, was trapped inside a world of appearances. So the affair became a sealed chamber, emotionally real, perhaps even deeply felt, yet structurally doomed. The more powerful the emotion, the more dangerous the truth became. And for a time, Delphine seems to have lived not outside that secret, but inside it. Vanity Fair's account of Delphine's later recollections describes Albert as a familiar presence in her early life. A man she knew well, a man she had a nickname for, a man who sent gifts and cards, visited, and even joined mother and daughter on holidays. That detail changes the emotional temperature of the whole scandal. This was not merely a child growing up with a rumor in the background. This was a child allowed enough closeness to feel attachment, but never enough truth to feel secure. Imagine the confusion of such a bond. Warmth without recognition, affection without legitimacy, presence without protection. And then came the true poison at the heart of it all: silence. Delphine later said that, as a teenager, once she was told who her real father was, she also understood that the truth had to remain hidden for the sake of the crown. She was not simply asked to keep a family confidence. She was, in effect, enlisted into the protection of a royal image. A child became a guardian of adult reputations. A daughter became a secret that had to discipline herself. That is where this story stops, being only romantic, and becomes deeply tragic. Because forbidden love in palaces rarely ends when the lovers drift apart. It survives as pressure, as shame, as a lesson passed on to the child. Your existence must be managed very carefully. What made the relationship truly toxic was not only that it had to stay hidden, but that the boundaries of love and denial kept shifting. Public reporting after Albert's later admission noted that Delphine claimed he had privately acknowledged her, supported her for a time, and then cut ties when he became king in 1993. If that account is true, the message was devastatingly clear. As long as he was a prince, there was room for emotional ambiguity. Once he wore the crown, ambiguity hardened into distance. The throne did not simply demand silence, it demanded abandonment. And that is why this chapter matters so much. Because the affair between Albert and Sybil was not just a beautiful mistake or a reckless passion from another era. It created a private world in which love was always conditional, always vulnerable to status, timing, and fear. Delphine grew up in the aftershock of that arrangement. She inherited the romance, yes, but also the cowardice, the evasions, and the unbearable contradiction of being loved just enough to be wounded, yet never enough to be claimed. By the time the secret began to crack in public, this was no longer a story about adultery. It was a story about the emotional debt left behind by adultery, protected at the highest level. And once that debt came due, the palace could no longer keep it contained. And then, after years of whispers, the scandal finally stepped out of the drawing rooms and into the cold machinery of the law. What had once lived in biographies, rumours, and aristocratic half-sentences now acquired a date, a place, and a legal vocabulary. Brussels, court filings, appeals, DNA. The sort of language that strips romance of its perfume and leaves only consequence. By 2014, Delphine was no longer merely the woman said to be the former king's hidden daughter. She was asking a court to establish the identity of her biological father. It was a staggering image for Belgium, a royal secret, no longer protected by etiquette, being forced into the public record by a daughter who had plainly decided she would rather endure scandal than continue enduring erasure. Reuters reported at the time that her legal action could even alter her position in relation to the royal line, which made the matter feel, suddenly, not private at all, but constitutional. From that moment on, the case developed with the slow, merciless rhythm of a public reckoning. There were hearings, procedural fights, technical arguments, and the sort of legal delay that can make pain feel endless. But delay did not kill the story. It fed it. Every appeal made the silence look more deliberate. Every resistance from Albert's side made the question grow larger in the public imagination. If he was not her father, why fight so hard? And if he was, what exactly had the monarchy believed it could keep hidden forever? In November 2018, the Brussels Appeals Court ordered Albert II to undergo a DNA paternity test, overturning an earlier ruling and escalating the case into something impossible to dismiss. The old royal strategy of distance was collapsing. This was no longer a discreet embarrassment. It was now a former king being compelled by the courts to submit his body to proof. That was the moment the scandal truly changed temperature. Because a royal affair can survive gossip. A royal family can outlast memoirs, interviews, even humiliation. But DNA is different. DNA has no sense of decorum. It does not bow to palaces. It does not soften itself for crowns. And when Albert still resisted, the confrontation became even more dramatic. In May 2019, a Belgian court ordered that he would be fined €5,000 a day until he complied with the testing order. Think of the symbolism of that. A man who had once embodied the Belgian state was now being threatened day by day with a mounting financial penalty because he would not answer the most intimate question of all. The monarchy, once elevated by mystique, now appeared cornered by saliva, paperwork, and the terrible persistence of one woman who refused to disappear. Reuters later reported that Albert did in fact submit a DNA sample after the pressure intensified. And then came the blow that made denial impossible. In January 2020, Albert II's legal team acknowledged that the DNA test showed he was Delphine's biological father. Just like that, decades of ambiguity shattered. The palace could no longer hide behind omission, distance, or legal maneuver. Science had spoken where emotion had been denied. It is difficult to overstate the emotional violence of such a moment. For Delphine, it was vindication. Yes, but a devastating kind of vindication. Because it came not through a father's embrace, not through remorse, not through love freely given, but through compulsion, through laboratories, lawyers, and public humiliation. A truth that should have been whispered in private tenderness had instead arrived under the fluorescent light of legal defeat. The reaction was immediate and enormous, because this was no ordinary family confession. Belgium was watching a former sovereign lose control of his own narrative. International news agencies covered it. Courthouse images travelled across Europe. Delphine, who had once been treated as an awkward shadow at the edge of royal history, now stood at the very centre of it. And yet the scandal still had one final turn left. In October 2020, the Brussels Appeals Court granted her the title Princess of Belgium, confirmed her right to carry the name Saxe-Coburg, and extended royal titles to her children as well. It was not merely recognition, it was reversal. The woman once kept outside the official family portrait had forced the frame to widen. Even the Belgian monarchy's official website now lists Princess Delphine as the daughter of King Albert II, officially recognized in 2020. And that is where the scandal became something deeper than a paternity case. It became an indictment of the years before the courtroom, of all the people who knew enough to stay quiet, of all the rituals of royalty that ask human beings to carry unbearable truths in silence so that ceremony may remain intact. One cannot hear this story without asking the most painful question of all. Why did no one intervene earlier, before a daughter had to drag her own bloodline through the courts just to be acknowledged? By the time the ruling came, Delphine had won. But victories like that do not feel triumphant. They feel expensive. They feel like justice, arriving long after innocence has been spent. But legal victory is not the same thing as emotional repair. That is the cruel truth at the center of Delphine's story. By the time the courts had forced the truth into the open, the damage had already lived for decades. A father had been identified. A title had been granted. A bloodline had been restored on paper. Yet none of that could return the lost years. The birthdays passed in ambiguity, the long seasons in which silence had done the work of rejection. The law can establish facts. It can compel recognition. It can even rewrite official history. But it cannot recreate a childhood, and it cannot command tenderness. And still, the law mattered. It mattered because the Belgian monarchy, a system built on ceremony, lineage, and inherited legitimacy, had been forced to bow to something larger than image, truth. When Delphine was officially recognized, and later granted the title Princess of Belgium, the ruling did more than settle a private dispute. It exposed the limits of royal immunity in the modern age. A palace could delay, it could deny, it could protect appearances for years, but it could not forever stand against evidence, public scrutiny, and a daughter who had decided she would no longer live as a footnote in somebody else's biography. The fallout inside the family was far more delicate, because once the verdict arrived, the question was no longer whether Delphine existed in royal history. It was how the royal family would live with that fact. And that is a far more intimate challenge than any courtroom battle. How do half-siblings greet one another after decades of silence? How does a former king face the daughter he resisted for so long? How does a family built on protocol absorb a truth that entered by force rather than by trust? There were signs of a thaw, but not of a miracle. Delphine was no longer outside the gates in symbolic terms. She began to appear, cautiously, within the broader royal frame. The family could not pretend she did not belong. Yet this was never the sort of story that transforms overnight into warmth, reconciliation, and fairy tale healing. The emotional reality was more restrained, more European, more royal in its discomfort. Recognition came, but intimacy remained another matter. Formal acceptance is one thing. Private closeness is another. And people who have spent decades protecting themselves do not suddenly become vulnerable simply because a judge has spoken. Public reaction was equally divided between fascination and sympathy. To many, Delphine became a symbol of persistence, a woman who had stood against one of the most protected institutions in her country and won. To others, the spectacle itself felt tragic. Proof that even at the highest level of society, families can become theatres of denial, pride, and emotional cowardice. The scandal no longer belonged only to tabloids. It had become a national conversation about legitimacy, responsibility, and the hidden human costs of protecting power. And perhaps that is the most haunting consequence of all. In the end, Delphine did not merely win a title. She forced an entire monarchy to confront the distance between what it shows the world and what it asks people to suffer in private. And once a truth like that has been spoken aloud, nothing returns to the way it was before. In the end, Delphine did not leave behind a tragedy in the traditional royal sense. No assassination, no exile, no grand funeral procession wrapped in black velvet. What she left behind was something quieter and in many ways more unsettling. She left behind proof that in a modern monarchy, blood can be denied for years. But truth has a way of returning. Not always with grace, not always with mercy, but it returns. And when it does, it changes the family story forever. Belgium's own monarchy now officially identifies Princess Delphine as the daughter of King Albert II, recognized in 2020, a small sentence on an official page, perhaps, but one that cost years of pain to obtain. That is her real legacy. Not simply a title, but a correction. A woman once treated as an embarrassment became part of the official record. A daughter once kept at the edge of royal life forced the institution itself to redraw its boundaries. And in doing so, she became more than a controversial figure in a palace scandal. She became a symbol of what happens when private shame collides with public accountability. Her story did not destroy the monarchy, but it did strip away part of its old protection. The illusion that silence can always outlast evidence. There is also something deeply human in what followed. After the verdicts and the headlines, there were first meetings tentative, restrained, almost fragile. King Philippe met Delphine in October 2020, and later that same month, Albert and Queen Paola also met with her, speaking publicly of a path toward healing and reconciliation. It was not the sort of reconciliation that erases the past. Wounds like these do not vanish because a photograph is taken or a statement is issued. But those encounters mattered because they showed that even a family shaped by protocol could no longer avoid the emotional truth forever. And perhaps that is why this story lingers. Because at its heart, it was never only about royalty. It was about recognition, about the lifelong cost of being known in private, yet denied in public. About a daughter who refused to let power decide whether her existence was convenient enough to be admitted. Today, Princess Delphine is listed by the Belgian monarchy as a contemporary artist, living with her partner, James O'Hare, and their 2 children, not as a rumor, not as a whisper, but as part of the family itself. That may sound simple now, but in stories like this, simplicity is often the hardest victory of all. And perhaps that is the final lesson Delphine leaves behind. That truth, however delayed, is still a form of dignity. If this story moved you, subscribe for more royal histories hidden behind palace walls. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Was Delphine's victory justice, or justice that came far too late? And ring the bell so you do not miss the next story where power, love, and silence collide.